The free man is a warrior. In recent years, much has been made of freethinkers. This term refers to those willing to question even the deepest of societal orthodoxies. It's also used, ironically, to mean people who think they're doing that, but in fact only reinforce those orthodoxies. But if there is one philosopher who can truly claim to be a freethinker, it is Friedrich Nietzsche. He challenged some of our most treasured ideas, decrying them as false, pointless, or even outright harmful. In doing this, he became one of the most controversial thinkers in history, and he wants us to do the same. So, today we are going to look at some of his most neglected works, the free spirit works, Human All Too Human, Daybreak, and The Gay Science. Our quest is to find out what, for Nietzsche, makes a free thinker, and ask whether we want to follow in his footsteps. Before we get started, my thoughts on the free spirit works are heavily influenced by the Nietzsche scholar Matthew Meyer, to the extent that most of what I say here will in some way draw from his writing, and thus I highly recommend you check out his papers or books on the subject if you want to read some incredibly good modern Nietzsche scholarship. But with that out of the way, let's begin with Nietzsche's harsh critique of our very dearest values, ideas, and philosophies, and how he thinks they are simply superstitions. And if it's your first time here, then welcome. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. Freedom from illusions. The first of Nietzsche's free spirit works is often seen as an odd one out among his writings. Nietzsche is generally associated with passionate outbursts, bold declarations like God is dead, and an engaging, slightly mad style of philosophy. But Human All Too Human stands out because it is the complete opposite. Nietzsche states at the beginning of the book that he plans to put the concepts humanity holds dear under a harsh, scientific lens to see if they hold water. The aim here is to tear away old ideas so that the free spirit can proceed without any illusions going forward. In itself, there is nothing particularly unusual about this. Philosophers quite often evaluate our common sense concepts against scientific discoveries to see what the philosophical implications of those discoveries might be. But Nietzsche has a slightly higher goal in mind. He wants to expose some of the key ideas that govern our lives as either empty or meaningless, and so achieve a greater level of freedom. And what he means by freedom will become clear as the video goes on. This can get quite abstract, but some examples might help illustrate what I mean. One of the concepts Nietzsche mercilessly attacks is that of free will and free choices. At this point, Nietzsche is a hard determinist and he is not afraid to show it. He claims that it's obvious that just as the laws of nature dictate every other movement in the world, so too do they dictate our decisions. To say that we own our choices in any meaningful way is just superstition. We make certain choices because of our characters, and those characters in turn are shaped by either inherited traits or some set of environmental factors, none of which was initially in our control. For Nietzsche, there is no unconditioned choice, no soul that hovers above and can intervene into this mechanistic process. At this point in his philosophy, there is only brute necessity, governing all things and all of mankind. But if this is all so obvious, then why haven't we accepted this truth? What keeps us believing in classic libertarian free will? Well, Nietzsche thinks it is all to do with responsibility and a sense of meaning. For Nietzsche, thinking that we are responsible for our decisions and ultimately our lives is part of what can make existence seem fulfilling. This is pretty intuitive. There's a reason why so many therapy techniques are designed to imbue a sense of responsibility for our lives. Even though we recognize that much of the circumstances of our existence are out of our control, we want to think that we can do something about them, and that it is us making our choices, not some mechanistic movement that works through us. We want to think that, if we desired to, we could have chosen differently, and that we can take credit for when our decisions go well. It gives us a feeling of control over our lives, and without that control, how could we even begin to feel purposeful? If we thought that our decisions were just the same as dominoes falling, that engenders quite a natural feeling of despair. It seems like one of our intuitive psychological needs is to feel some kind of power over our own choices. Nietzsche would surely recognize this as well, since his analysis of human psychology features power and power over the self pretty heavily. If he's going to chalk so much up to humans desiring to feel powerful, then he must recognize this is a pretty bitter pill to swallow. And he does agree. He thinks this is exactly why we have not recognized determinism thus far. Well, that, and the extension, that if we are not responsible for our decisions, then no one else is either. Nietzsche argues that without true free will, we also cannot hold moral responsibility. And so all of this talk of people being good or evil is simply superstition. He says this is one of the hardest truths to come to terms with, for a variety of reasons. From a personal perspective, it means there is no value or even sense in striving to be better because no such concept exists. But, additionally, it makes the landscape of people flat and featureless. There are no value distinctions where we can say one person is more morally good than another person. There are just meat sacks wandering around, following their gears. It's a tough old worldview. Though, in classic Nietzsche fashion, he does put a positive spin on this, saying that it restores our innocence. Perhaps the most important idea Nietzsche does away with in Human All Too Human is metaphysics itself. For those who haven't necessarily come across this term before, metaphysics is the study of ultimate reality, or what is behind the world of appearance. For example, a Christian metaphysics would involve God and the heavens, since we can't directly see them, but the Christian argues that they nonetheless do exist. A classic scientific realist metaphysics holds that there is a real world and we find out about this real world through our senses. But Nietzsche decries all of this metaphysical thinking as not so much false, but just pointless. He admits that there may be some ultimate reality behind our perceptions, but any such realm would, by definition, be closed off to us. So, metaphysical claims are cast into the fire alongside free will and morality. And again, Nietzsche thinks this is a hard truth. He expects it to have a psychological effect. He agrees with Schopenhauer that metaphysics is often the way humans discover significance in our lives. If we find ourselves dissatisfied with the mundane world of appearances around us, or the drudgery of our everyday experience, or just our sufferings, then we can find solace in a world infinitely more important than anything we can perceive. To again use a religious example, since those are the most extreme form of this, if you think that this life is just a speck compared to the glory of God and eternity, then that may help you cope when things go horribly wrong in this world. It also gives a natural purpose to this life as a way of achieving the next one. For both Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, most of us have a hunger for some metaphysical structure to make our lives seem like they matter, which is fair enough. Thus, Nietzsche sees the death of metaphysics as something borderline unbearable. Nonetheless, in the interests of freedom and truth, the spirits must discard this as well. By extension, Nietzsche thinks they must also dispense with religion. This is all well and good, but why is Nietzsche doing all of this? Well, at this point, Nietzsche explicitly wants to follow truth wherever it will lead. He wants to find out what the unbearable truths of life are like when we get rid of all of the comforting concepts like free will and morality and metaphysics that make existence seem a bit more full, a bit more meaningful. Nietzsche is done with what he thinks are the illusions of mankind. The first task of the free spirit is to see life for what it is. For Nietzsche, at this stage, existence is the barren wasteland he lays out here. If you embark on your own quest for ultimate truth, however, you might come to different conclusions. This is the first sense in which the spirit is free. They are free from illusion. The second sense in which Nietzsche thinks he has made the reader freer is in what they can ask. Now that they are free from thinking about goodness in itself and metaphysics in itself and religion in itself, they can turn their attention to other questions. Since they're not worried about eternal moral truths, they can instead ask, where did moral concepts come from? Since they are unconcerned with metaphysics, they can then ask, why do people construct metaphysical theories? And since they've already rejected God, they can now ask, what does this idea of God do exactly? And as we will see, this line of questioning ends up incredibly radical and threatens to overturn our very idea of truth itself. This is where Nietzsche leaves things in Human All Too Human. The free spirit is detached, contemplating these forbidden truths with a hard philosophical lens. Yet, he also freely admits that this would plunge most people into despair, and that it requires a naturally cheerful disposition to reject this natural conclusion. I think this is why, when some people read Nietzsche, they think he is a nihilist. Because at this point, he has destroyed an awful lot, and so far, he's not built anything to replace it. But before we talk about his potential replacements, let's look at Nietzsche's psychological inquiries into these concepts, and question our views on people, custom, and individuality. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider becoming one of my wonderful supporters on Patreon. I also have a free Substack if you like. The link is in the description. 2. Freedom from society. One of Nietzsche's final works, Ecce Homo, bears the subtitle, How to Become Who One Is. In some ways, this simple sentence sums up an awful lot of Nietzsche's philosophy. From the very beginning to the very end of his work, he is constantly concerned with the single and singular individual. In fact, many critics of Nietzsche, including myself at points, accuse him of not giving enough attention to man as a social animal, at least not in his existential recommendations. However, this almost seems like a deliberate choice, because Nietzsche is deeply skeptical of the way the majority of people think and act, and how it might affect the project of these so-called free spirits. I'm actually planning a whole video on the conception of other people in Nietzsche's philosophy, so do hit subscribe so you don't miss that. I'm slowly getting the hang of this YouTube thing. We see Nietzsche's ambivalence about people all the way back in Human All Too Human, where his final chapter is entitled Man Alone with Himself. There, he touches upon the danger of public convictions to the serious pursuit of truth. The trouble with the truths the free spirit is discovering is that they are fundamentally harmful to mankind and to society. It is not necessarily a great thing to go around telling people that there's no free will, no good, no bad, and no real metaphysical world. Such a thing could drive people to despair. Hell, when I do videos on free will on this channel, I always have people in my comments borderline having meltdowns. In order to continue questioning, the free spirit begins to erode the foundational assumptions of their society, and so is likely to just piss everyone off. It's tempting to interpret this in a modern, self-aggrandizing, I'm a lone truth teller kind of way, and there is an element of that. But, importantly, Nietzsche doesn't think the people are wrong when they say that these propositions are bad for society. He thinks that too. He just doesn't mind as much. However, this does mean he presents his philosophical projects as solitary. This is reinforced in his other writings, where he draws upon Michel de Montaigne, the French philosopher, who also famously retreated into his tower by himself to conduct his philosophical study. Nietzsche is clear that this intellectual quest must be undertaken alone. This is also because Nietzsche's next questions examine society from the outside, as it were. Now that he has dismissed all of these ideas in the name of scientific inquiry, he wants to know if we can live without them. Or, as he puts it in Human All Too Human, where their irrationality is essential to be happy. And to do this, he needs to know what these concepts were for, what their psychological origins are. And he focuses on one of his favorite topics, morality. Primarily, this occurs in Daybreak, where Nietzsche discusses his views on ethical systems, power, and social dynamics. This is long before his in-depth, specific critique of Christianity as a resentment-based moral system, and is instead a much broader treatment of moral systems and ethical frameworks as a whole. Appropriately, the subtitle to Daybreak is Thoughts on the Prejudices of Morality. And this is generally how Nietzsche sees morality, as a prejudice. As Matthew Mayer argues, Nietzsche's aim is to reveal the fundamentally irrational drives behind our moral philosophies. Interestingly, we can also see here why Nietzsche was such a big influence on early psychoanalysts, considering how much he analyzes explicit philosophical commitments and behavior in terms of our less conscious drives. Among these drives are habit, custom, and tradition. Nietzsche thinks that without a concerted effort to question the customs of the society you're born into, you're very likely to absorb them uncritically and see them as almost unquestionable fact. He even says this compromises our ability to listen to our feelings, since these emotional drives will have also been conditioned by our upbringing, preventing us from becoming who we are and embarking on the Nietzschean process of self-cultivation and self-overcoming. This is yet another reason Nietzsche thinks the free spirit must free themselves from society. It is not just that society will reject them, though that's also true. It is that simply being immersed in communities will influence how that person thinks, making it much harder to take the outside view on the customs, prejudices, and morality of that society. He even suggests that a true free spirit may be viewed as outright mad by the community they were raised in. Here, we also see the beginnings of Nietzsche's concept of power that would come to dominate his analysis of human psychology in his later works. He analyzes feelings of moral superiority in terms of power, wanting to make your fellow man conform to your point of view, but also in terms of pleasure. In one aphorism, he explains how a moral descriptor can make an unpleasant feeling into a pleasant one. He uses the example of the same internal sensation becoming either a feeling of cowardice or one of humility, depending on how it is viewed and described. It is similar to Hamlet's observation that there's nothing good nor bad, but thinking makes it so, or even some modern techniques for dealing with anxiety, which reframe the same physiological experience as excitement. It arguably also prefigures the work of modern neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett, whose research has demonstrated that how we describe our emotions can actually transform how they physically feel to us, or Ian Hacking's idea of the looping effect in psychological diagnoses, where expectations of patient behavior can actually alter how that patient chooses to behave. Nietzsche presents morality not as discovering some truth about what is good or what is evil, but instead as these psychological plays for power or joy that are then calcified over time until they become habit, custom, and a full-blown system. Considering the close philosophical ties between morality and religion, it is no mystery that Nietzsche gives a similar analysis to religion itself, stating that the goals of Christianity, Buddhism, and Brahmanism are to instill a feeling of power in the believer. Nietzsche says that the classic moral emotions like pity are also shows of power, with the pitiful attempting to extract a feeling of strength by knowing that they can still inspire feelings in the more powerful by means of that pity. You will notice here the origins of his later evisceration of Christian ethics in Beyond Good and Evil and the Genealogy of Morals. In his book, Meyer questions whether Nietzsche is committing the genetic fallacy here by attempting to disprove the concepts of God or morality merely by analysing their origins. And I do agree that it would be the genetic fallacy if he were trying to do this. But I think that Nietzsche's aims are slightly different here. Whereas in Human All Too Human, Nietzsche makes direct philosophical critiques of metaphysics, God, morality, and more, he also recognises that this alone is not enough to stop them from motivating people's behaviour and underpinning their emotions. Meyer himself notices this, stating that the free spirit is now moving from altering their thoughts to altering their feelings. However, seen through this lens, examining the origins and non-rational purposes of these sacred ideas makes much more sense. I don't think that Nietzsche is trying to offer a classic, direct philosophical refutation of these concepts here. Instead, I think he's trying to make them less motivating. He knows that even if you were to totally disprove a given concept, if someone is enmeshed in a society that relies on that concept, that won't really free them from it in any meaningful way. This is something that's now appreciated by many cognitive scientists, who recognize that there is an emotional and a cognitive side to beliefs and attitudes. But by taking a step back and viewing these ideas as not originating from above or in the world, but rather crafted by ordinary people for all too human ends, it makes them seem less sanctified, so to speak. It demystifies them in a way that doesn't so much prove them false, but makes them seem much more mundane. To draw from Mircea Eliade's work on the philosophy of sacredness, it no longer presents these ideas as given by some all-important hidden reality, but instead as resting on purely human authority. And if it only rests on human attitude, it can be discarded by human attitude as well. This aspect of the free spirit clearly links with Nietzsche's general critique of society. Here, he is not simply arguing against these concepts, but declawing them, and thus he attempts to isolate the free spirit from their particular cultural context. If in the last section he wanted to free our cognition from these ideas, he now wants to free our emotions as well. Though, if simply losing the propositions were seen as distressing, I think losing the emotional resonance that they bring would be far more so. But Nietzsche doesn't even stop here. His final victim is perhaps his most controversial, and that is the value of truth itself. 3. Freedom from truth. In Nietzsche's most famous aphorism, entitled The Madman, he declares, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him." Even people who think Friedrich Nietzsche is a strange type of German cheese have heard God is dead at some point or another. But most people don't know how the passage continues. The so-called madman does not just declare that God is dead, he talks about the shadows of God that will remain for many years to come. And, as Maya points out, one of these shadows is the value of truth itself. It seems strange to question whether truth is a good thing, but Nietzsche has been implicitly asking this question all through the video so far. Each time he unveils a new forbidden truth, he points out how destructive it could be to learn. It's an intuition he shares with Schopenhauer, who also thought that the truths of life were too unbearable for most people to face head-on. We've already sort of touched upon this point, so I won't go too into it here. In itself, we also probably already know that truths are not always happy to hear. To discover that your lover is cheating on you or that you are wrong about something very close to your heart is deeply unpleasant. This is a rather strange example, but when I'm not researching or writing for these videos, I like to unwind by watching the reality TV show Married at First Sight Australia. The conceit of the show is pretty simple. Two people get married without having previously met and then desperately try to make it work. As you can imagine, it's quite often a disaster, and couples often end up on completely different pages regarding how the other feels. So, a few times a series, one half of the couple will confidently assert that the other person likes or loves them, only for their wife/husband to go, "Hang on, no I don't," and then proceed to list off a series of problems that they have with their relationship and their partner. Their lover is often devastated by this revelation, and yet they almost always say something like, "It is better to know the truth." But why am I talking about an Australian reality TV show? Well, Nietzsche thinks that most of us reason about the truth in quite a similar way. Even if a truth is hurtful, we think it is good to know the truth in and of itself. But hang on. Nietzsche just said that there was nothing good or bad, but rather we judge things to be good or bad ourselves. So how can we consistently say that the truth is itself valuable if there are no values out there in the world? This is the culmination of Nietzsche's free spirit project. Having freed himself from the superstitions of God and morality and metaphysics, he now wants to find freedom from the greatest superstition of all, the belief in the inherent value of truth. Now, bear in mind, Nietzsche does not deny that the truth is often useful. He's not saying that engineers should start making up the equations when they want to build bridges. He is rather arguing that, in itself, the truth holds no value. We give it value. The structure of this argument is fascinating because he undermines his original project. Having started out by assuming the value of truth, that value has eventually overcome all values, including itself. The value of truth, just like the value of everything else, is human, all too human. Combine this with his observations about metaphysics, and you get the following troubling conclusion. There is no valuable truth about ultimate reality. There are only appearances and predictions about those appearances. I really like this part in Nietzsche's writings because while many people are quite happy to nod along as he dispenses with metaphysics or morality or religion, they have an instinctive reaction to his final declaration that truth itself need not have any value. I feel it too. There is something deep inside me that rebels against any attempt to say that objective truth is not, in and of itself, incredibly valuable and incredibly worthwhile. When I read Nietzsche warning about the dangers of certain truths, I want to say, hit me with it. Truth is more important than comfort. But then, Nietzsche turns around to me and says, that too is superstition. If there is no importance, then there is no importance for truth either. This is also why many people regard Nietzsche as a postmodern thinker. Although it's worth noting that some postmodern thinkers are significantly more keen on ideas of truth than Nietzsche is. Postmodernism as a concept definitely deserves its own video. In Nietzsche's view, our valuation of truth in itself relies on an old idea put forward by Socrates and Plato, that the truth would necessarily lead to human flourishing. We often assume this in difficult truths as well. We might bemoan learning them, but we also recognize that we are now in a better place to move forward with our lives with this new knowledge. But Nietzsche simply rejects this supposed necessary connection. What about learning that there are no values or that there is no world beyond the world of appearances would be helpful for our futures? Realizing that the universe is cold, uncaring, and devoid of anything worth striving for when it's looked at with a cool, rational eye is the opposite of edifying. For many people, it makes life seem not worth living. Though, as we will see, Nietzsche thinks we can learn to live even without values being given to us by ultimate reality. In some ways, this whole project is Nietzsche's critique of the Enlightenment. He begins Human All Too Human, parroting classical Enlightenment values, chief among them that we should search for truth whatever the cost. Yet, he thinks that this line of reasoning will ultimately end with us devaluing truth, since we will eventually recognize that nothing is valuable except insofar as it is viewed as valuable by us. And we don't have to value truth if we don't want to. We can subordinate it to other things. In a rather fascinating twist of fate, this is the same critique often leveled at atheistic Enlightenment philosophy by religious thinkers such as Friedrich Nietzsche, who said that the Enlightenment lay the foundations for nihilism. It even prefigures critiques by modern Christian revivalists, who sometimes suggest that Enlightenment values are self-undermining without God. I always think it's quite funny how much Nietzsche and religious thinkers agree on the consequences of atheistic Enlightenment thinking. It's just that Nietzsche wants to learn how to move forward without reintroducing God, whereas most religious thinkers take it as proof of how absurd the Enlightenment worldview truly is. Maybe this is the horseshoe theory of atheism. I don't know. Let me know in the comments. However, Nietzsche still thinks that questioning the value of truth is vitally important for any budding free spirits because, paradoxically, it provides them with a way out of the despair caused by all of the questioning that has come before it. So far, the passion and the commitment the free spirit has had to truth has cleared away all of the previous values that kept them afloat. In the name of fearless inquiry, they have destroyed the very foundations they used to bear the brunt of reality. If it were not for this final undermining, Nietzsche thinks they would be left with nothing. There would be no way to create new values because the free spirit would remain committed to only valuing truths that are out there. And they've just admitted that, by this criteria, there is nothing worth valuing, including truth. By valuing truth alone, the free spirit had dug themselves a nihilistic hole. They had the freedom to destroy, but not the freedom to create. However, By abandoning the value of truth in and of itself, the free spirit rejects the authority of the world and claims that power for themselves. Thus, their creative project can finally begin. So, let's turn to that project. By rejecting all that made life seem valuable, Nietzsche carved a wound into our philosophy. So how does he now propose to heal it? 4. Freedom to create. In his magnum opus, Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche outlines the 3 transformations or metamorphoses of the Übermensch. The final of these stages is the child, a creative spirit who is able to overcome nihilism by forging new values to replace the old discarded ones. His new philosophers, or philosophers of the future in Beyond Good and Evil, serve a very similar function. They are meant to transcend existential despair by legislating values for a new, bright world. However, in The Gay Science and elsewhere, we see hints as to what this process might look like, though Nietzsche never spells it out in dizzying amounts of detail. Nietzsche thinks that in our obsession with the value of truth, objective morality, and God, we have forgotten to seize command of our own wills. That is, we've got so into the habit of turning to something higher than ourselves to tell us what to do that we now fall into despair without them. We believe that we need these grand metaphysical structures to dictate and direct our lives. But Nietzsche disagrees. He says we only think this because we've been reliant on them for so long. Instead, we can reject this craving for higher authority and forge our own path and ultimately our own values. You can see how this thought influenced Camus' later idea that we should rebel against the meaninglessness of the world and so make life bearable in that way. But to do this requires a strong will, or as Nietzsche might put it, an organized will. Nietzsche often thinks of the human will as like a series of drives that are sometimes in conflict and sometimes acting together. In order to overcome nihilism and create new values, we need our wills pointing in a single direction. This requires a certain amount of discipline, but he doesn't mean discipline in the sense of getting up early and having cold showers. It is rather freeing our mind of internal divides so that our will can become laser-focused. Although Nietzsche doesn't provide a systematic treatment of this in his published works, he expands upon the organization of the will in his notebooks. And they are consistent with his published works, so I do think we can take this as genuinely what Nietzsche thought, rather than an idea he was playing with in the privacy of his own desk. Incidentally, this also gives us a way to reconceive of our wills despite determinism. Nietzsche doesn't want to judge wills as good or evil in accordance with free choices, but rather as organized or disorganized. An organized will does not succumb to nihilism even when all of these higher truths have been cleared away. It considers its own desires inherently valuable. It's a bit like how we don't have to think, I should move my hand to stop it from burning, to remove our hand from a hot stove. It is an intrinsically motivating sensation. Nietzsche doesn't give a step-by-step guide on how to achieve this organization, but he does say that we'll need to direct all of our drives, including seemingly ugly or evil ones, like our will to cruelty and our wish to seize power over the world. Nietzsche thinks that these baser instincts should not be disregarded, as he accuses Christianity of doing, but rather organized and harnessed. Again, we can see the influence this had on later psychoanalytic thinkers, where incorporating instinctive but seemingly bad drives is often part of the therapeutic process. As Meyer points out, Nietzsche also emphasized the aestheticization of life. That is, the perception of life itself, even its worst aspects, as somehow beautiful and so seemingly valuable. This is not the expectation that existence will itself go well or be extremely pleasurable, but rather a way to rejoice in even its most painful parts. Nietzsche fully admits that this would be incredibly difficult, and looking at his biography, I am doubtful that he ever achieved anything close to this. But here is where the clearing of values from earlier is important, and especially the clearing of the value of truth. Now that there is nothing good nor bad, but thinking makes it so, our power to potentially see anything as good or bad is revealed. Of course, it's very easy to love the pleasurable parts of life, but how do we love the awful parts as well? In classic Nietzsche fashion, he doesn't spell out an exact process here, but suggests we should take inspiration from tragic art, where even the most horrific stories are lent a kind of strange dignity and beauty. Also, Nietzsche doesn't think that the way to make life beautiful will be the same for everyone. He increasingly emphasizes an experimental attitude to living, where the philosopher tries on different ideas and different values to see what fits their particular psychological setup. They can do this because they are no longer beholden to only caring about true values, but can now originate their own. The aim here is twofold. The first is that they will find what works for them, and so learn to become who they are. But also, just the attitude of experimentation towards life encourages them to take it that bit less seriously. A lot of Nietzsche's works are about the interplay between seriousness and lightness, tragedy and comedy, and the experimental attitude is almost inherently comic. It does not take life too seriously because it recognizes that it is just trying things out. This general lightness of spirit seems incredibly important to Nietzsche, as he even says, "I would only believe in a God that knows how to dance." Laughter is also vital in Nietzsche's philosophy, and he talks of a laughter that will eventually overpower all tragedies. And so, we have two parts to this aestheticization of existence. On the one hand, it must bear all of the dignity of a tragedy, and on the other, it must have all the joy and gaiety of comedy. I definitely want to explore this in more detail in a part 2 video, as I am really only skimming the surface here. Nietzsche's treatment of seriousness and laughter and comedy and tragedy is absolutely fascinating. The ultimate aim of all this is to achieve amor fati, the ability to love everything and so to desire that nothing should be different. At first, this seems to conflict with Nietzsche's idea that we should not weaken our wills, but upon closer examination, it's a bit more subtle than this. Nietzsche is not suggesting that we should never will things, but rather that we should have the ability to love whatever comes to pass, to rejoice in life itself, whether it is bringing suffering, happiness, ease, or difficulty. Though, I should note, it's very much an open question whether this can actually be achieved. Nietzsche seems to think that it can, though personally, I'm a little bit more skeptical. Nonetheless, it is quite a nice ideal to have, and potentially quite a nice ideal to strive for. It is quite life-edifying, as Nietzsche would say. And Nietzsche caps all of this off with a fascinating thought experiment. Imagine that you were told you would be forced to live this life over and over again for all eternity. Everything would come to pass just as it has done. Would you cry out that this was unendurable and beg to be released from this sorry fate? Or would you rejoice, knowing that this life that you love so much will return to you over and over again? Nietzsche thinks if we can honestly say we would wish for life's eternal recurrence, then we have learnt to truly love it. For him, this is genuine freedom. The freedom to know that the world gives us no values, yet to make life itself feel so valuable, so worth living, that you would happily go through it again and again for eternity. This is the Nietzschean definition of finding life truly beautiful, and the ultimate sign that we have made our philosophies and our very existences into works of art. Has there ever been a free spirit who has reached such heights? I don't know, and to be honest, I don't know if there ever will be. But, as ever, Nietzsche provides a unique perspective on what it means to be free and to think freely. And he asks whether we can learn to accept the real direct consequences of a post-Enlightenment world, where values are simply what we make of them. But if you want to learn more about this fascinating figure, I have a video on why he is so unrelentingly controversial right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.